So in terms of what governments need to do to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, we need to start in the beginning in terms of the specific challenges that they face structurally. So in many countries, the power sector, generation, transmission, distribution, is largely publicly held, which represents its own complication in terms of technical expertise, access to the latest technologies, business model innovation, political interference in policy setting and pricing. And it's clear that public finances have been built on the fossil fuel economy base, meaning import and sales duties on fossil fuels and automobiles. It remains an important source of revenue. But at the same time, if we look at reality, about 70% of the power sector is sorry, I should say, 70% of the global energy sector subsidies are issued to fossil fuel. And then the remaining 20% is for renewable energy and then 10% for biofuels. And so we've built in these inefficiencies and locked in this risk. And so to get out of this risk, it's about reforming and transforming the entire economy, meaning looking at new pockets of revenue that do exist, that perhaps do not build in these long-term lock-in risks the way fossil fuel does. We've seen that many of the economies, especially in South Asia, were crippled in 2021 and 2022 as well, due to the inability to afford the LNG cargoes, which resulted in gas and power shortages. And so there's a lot of risk that can be taken out of the system. However, to do this, it's about ensuring that your economy transforms and generates new revenue, new job opportunities, more resilient to the future climate economy. So fossil fuel subsidies compared to most countries' investment in clean energy infrastructure, it's very clear that a lot of the funding for subsidies goes to fossil fuels. So recent data from 2020 shows that 70% of all subsidies goes to the fossil fuel sector, 20% to renewable energy, and then 6% to biofuels and 3% to nuclear. What this means is it should be no surprise that we have a fossil fuel centered economy. And what we need to do is ensure that we transfer these subsidies to where the job opportunities are, and where we could have new technologies that remove risk from the power system and are more resilient due to incoming weather extremes. And so having centrally planned and distributed renewable energy is likely more resilient for one's economy than the fossil fuel powered system we have today. So in terms of subsidies that governments might want to evaluate in the context of climate change, this can include taxes on power, taxes on cars, transportation, taxes in various different sectors, industry as well. So there are many ways that the government actually subsidizes the fossil fuel sector directly and indirectly. The easy one to look into is power sector subsidies, electricity prices, where the true cost of fossil fuel is usually north of 50% higher than what it should actually be should we have a renewable energy system. And this is true for especially small island states and small island grids, Indonesia, Philippines, Southeast Asia particularly, where diesel costs are incredibly expensive. Gas, coal, all have very high marginal cost, which means that it's all passed on to the consumer. And if it's not subsidized by government, then it means it's more expensive for the consumer overall. So there are different subsidies that could be redirected to ensure that the risks coming from the investment don't harm communities or industry. In terms of industry competitiveness, this is also where governments subsidize in order to ensure that the industry stays competitive if power sector or power prices are high. So there are many options on the table to reform taxation and subsidies in order to drive a more clean and resilient future. How countries can ensure that phasing out subsidies does not negatively impact vulnerable populations comes with a just transition in a way that is putting people first. Because as we see, many just transitions put companies and corporates first. But what's really central to ensuring the impact is positive on the vulnerable population is to have transition plans that have them at the center in terms of if they're in the fossil fuel industry, that there should be either retirement benefits or ways that they could move into other industry that's higher value so that the overall net benefit is positive. And then in terms of the industry itself, the plan in itself is critical because it's not a 0 to 100 shift, but rather it's how could we slowly displace expensive fossil fuel and replace it with renewable energy capacity that generates more job opportunities and reduces risk in the overall system. So there is a way to do this, and climate vulnerable countries are putting together prosperity plans in order to show how this transition could happen if capital were made available, low cost capital was made available today to ensure this phasing out of subsidies in a way that doesn't negatively impact the population. So the strategies to address stranded assets means getting to the asset early and not when it's too late and already stranded and leading to a lot of economic losses. So when it comes to what strategies are in play, there are many that we already see playing out. One is for small island states and small island grids. There's already displacement of diesel through hybridization of renewable energy with the existing diesel system, and then eventually phasing it out completely. Other strategies include buying out fossil fuel contracts and transforming them into renewable energy contracts. The issue is not that we need to shift very quickly, but rather how do we do it in a phased approach? And we already see, for example, in the Philippines, there's a private sector deal that has effectively reduced the life of a coal company in exchange for investing in new renewable energy because there is math that proves and prices that prove that they will be stranded in the future. So the trick is to get to it this decade before 2030 instead of after. So how one would ensure a just transition while phasing down or phasing out fossil fuels in labor, social, and economic terms. One is when it comes to the just transition, it's important to figure what exactly is the most important. So one is labor. Labor is critical to the overall functioning of the economy. The second would be the power system itself. When the phasing down happens, can it sustain itself with renewable energy? And the answer has always been yes, because we have built modernized grids. We know how to manage them. There's technology in place, so that's actually doesn't have to be the central of just transition because that technically works. Labor, on the other hand, is something that requires a just transition because of the skill sets, as well as the all the social impact and economic impact that a country could face if one were to lose a full sector in one go. But rather, how do we ensure that the labor that was in fossil fuel has, or in other words, the labor in the fossil fuel industry should be the first to benefit from the transition. And the reason for this is they have paid the price in health impact, um, the population in that country likely has paid through high prices, potentially subsidizing pollution. And so I think in terms of the just transition, it's really centered around labor rather than anything else, because when it comes to corporates, there's such thing as refinancing, and there is such thing as other types of financial structuring that could be put in place to ensure that the outcomes are positive. But for labor, they don't have the same access to capital the way corporates do, and so they should be at the center of the just transition. In terms of recommendations for others trying to undertake similar efforts to phase down fossil fuel subsidies, it's about putting in place the technology, the system, and the livelihood opportunities you want your population to have. So the phasing down of fossil fuels means the phasing in of these industries that you want to build. And so much of what you already have committed to the power sector can stay in the power sector, but would require a more modernized take on technology. The other thing to note is a lot of these countries that are dependent on fossil fuel imports have actually a lot of renewable energy opportunity. But beyond that, there are other higher value industry that they can build, and that it's time to build it today, this decade. And so these subsidies may be wasted in an industry that doesn't give you much value, doesn't give you much return. And so, because as we're in a planetary climate emergency, there's an opportunity to play a meaningful role in the transformation. And this can be done through utilizing these subsidies for modernized technology, for labor scale up, or looking into other industries that will be very important as we reach a much warmer world, and will also need to this will also factor into trade opportunities moving forward. So in terms of how countries can better prepare for this transition, it's about having good plans in place. And countries already have an understanding of what sectors, what industry, what economy they want to build. What needs to be factored in is all the climate impacts, the energy transition risk, and the spillover risks as a result of what other countries are doing and what other economies and trade um, will be doing in the future. And so with this in mind, they can then build new macroeconomic models in order to take into account all these impacts, and then from there use that as a basis to design what would then reduce these impacts and actually beyond that enable prosperity outcomes. How do we have development positive climate action? And that's the heart of the climate prosperity plans. And so we already have examples from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. They have climate prosperity plans, and it illustrates there what their power sector will look like, but more importantly, what sectors benefit from a renewable energy power system. And also with that, how they can build resilience with a low carbon and climate resilient economy. And we see with data and analytics that the share of GDP on the power used for the power sector is far less in a renewable energy powered system, just because there's more prosperity opportunities around higher value jobs, which means higher income levels, and the industry you can build around it is more sustainable. It means your export base is powered by a system that is fit for the climate in terms of its 1.5C compatible, and that is a survival limit for everyone. And so being able to contribute to that means more economic gains. As you think about eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, some factors to consider to accelerate this decision would be the price, the actual price, the true cost of this power. The second is, where is this power coming from? Is it domestically sourced or is it imported? The third is the trade-offs in terms of the subsidies, the costs, the high costs, the dependence of fossil fuel on your economy, does that change? Does that improve your negotiating power? Does that improve the way you could shape your industries? And more often than not, we find that these factors are already in play, and so there is an economic reason, and it's a valid one, to transform your economy away from fossil fuel and have a co-benefit of carbon reductions, because actually it's development first, for many developing countries, and for all developing countries. And then when it comes to countries that may have fossil fuel reserves, and would like to exploit these resources, what we find is, in reality, the country takes all the risk. The private sector proponent that comes in, that tries to help extract and sell, does not take enough risk. And so this is why we see many fossil fuel dependent countries, dependent on exports, are not necessarily um, not necessarily reaped the benefits, because there's intrinsically something wrong with the risk sharing when it comes to fossil fuel uh, exports. And so perhaps that is not the right way to go about development, because what's important is to have higher income in the pockets of the people, higher GDP opportunities, and less risk for the state and for its people.